Okay.
Next week is the historical materialism conference, and unfortunately, I think what time is the?
Yeah, you guys are on.
Yeah, I'm on
afternoon.
have an afternoon thing. I'm doing
they're
some.
at 3.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Oh, you're at 3. The other group is at 3.
Yeah.
So I should stay for that, and you're going to be there, right?
Well, I'm just going to moderate.
You're moderating, okay. So they're probably, unless you want to do, I mean, I'm good with doing a session during the evening. I can get a nice room at LIU, a seminar room, for either Thursday night or Friday night. You can let me know. I mean, I don't mind. I mean, maybe I'll just put out an email if people can make it. We'll do it Thursday. If not, it's going to be postponed probably to the following, a week.
You mean
But I'm
this session?
This coming
For this
Thursday
class.
or Friday, I can do,
For
in
this
the
class.
evening, yeah, for this class. Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, 7
At
o'clock,
what time?
6:30, 7 o'clock,
Oh.
7:30, yeah, anyway.
Yeah,
9 o'clock, I
can.
mean. Editions du minuit, midnight edition, yeah, anyway. All right, well, I'll put out an email to that effect. In terms of reading, what I would like to do is today I wanted to go through the Ricoeur, to kind of situate this very fundamental text, for what we're doing this semester. And the following week we'll probably go more into the text on narcissism, and then after that I'd like to read, and I'll send this out in syllabus form, so to speak, reading schedule form. But then I would like to go to this chapter 7 of the interpretation of dreams, and then at the same time we would read then Ricoeur alongside of that, since the second part of this is really looking at how to read Freud on the epistemological problem, and then the dream, the interpretation of culture, which begins on 159. So I'll send this to you, but that'll be the reading for the next 2 to 3 weeks. And I thought that sometime, it's going to be probably early May before we get to 4 fundamental concepts of Lacan. But I spend 2 weeks on that at least, and then I actually end with a Badiou conversation with
We're
him.
going to get to the Ricoeur soon, though.
We're with the Ricoeur today.
Oh, because I'm going to forget.
Oh, no, I
it.
don't want you to forget it. No. You have problems with long-term memory? No, I'm just kidding.
Just my RAM.
Right, okay, no problem. The RAM done. Okay, good. All right. So, yes, I was going to go through this today, and I was going to introduce, hermeneutics both as a discipline and then what Ricoeur is doing as well, right? In that sense. Let me see what I have here, in terms of work. So has everybody had a chance to read the Ricoeur, the first, yeah, good, okay. All right. And the other thing I certainly want to do, and I have that already pretty much elaborated, is a text devoted to reception of Freud in the United States. And particularly I want to emphasize a little bit Otto Fenichel as a resistance moment in dilution of psychoanalysis in the U.S. context, and then talk about the revisionism of the 50s and maybe, where we are today in many respects. So let me do this first. Hopefully this works. I wanted to give you, I'm going to do 2 things here. This is kind of a historical approach to what is hermeneutics. And hermeneutics is from, the Greek thief, the cattle thief, Hermes, who robbed from the rich and kind of redistributed allotments earlier. So this is the art of theft, etymologically in the beginning, the art of theft. So from the god Hermes, And I think I mentioned to you that Norman O'Brien, the great scholar, his first book was called Hermes the Thief. He started as a Greek and Latin scholar. He was a study in Greek. And Hermes the Thief was basically a code for stealth technology, by the way, in the war machine, in the warfare state. So, just to give you, how this works sometimes in everyday life in a different way. So, anyway, but hermeneutics has basically three senses, and this is traditional. We're going to do Ricoeur too. So the three senses, traditionally, are the contingent business of coming to an understanding. And I emphasize contingent, very arbitrary, of coming to an understanding. The second sense would be a canon that's established of the conventions of interpreting the text. And the third is it's basically a philosophical theory, and Ricoeur takes this up later, right? So these are the three primary senses of what hermeneutics or hermeneutic. Yeah, that's probably better. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, but you can read, right? I mean, I won't overcoat, but anyway, a philosophical theory being the last one here. Okay, so so what happens here, and this is, the main figure in the background here, well, there are two main figures in the 19th century. Wilhelm Dilthey, right, who you've probably heard of. And Heinrich Schleiermacher. And Schleiermacher was the one to use the coming to an understanding and hermeneutical principles in terms of interpreting biblical texts, doing biblical exegesis. So Schleiermacher was very, very important to a tradition. This morphs into Rudolf Bultmann, right, and what's his name? Rudolf Otto. The idea of the holy, and Rudolf Bultmann did a lot of things, in terms of biblical hermeneutics in the 20s and the 30s. These were people that were very influential on Paul Tillich, who was a socialist, who was at the Union Theological Seminary. So this is a long trajectory. Of course, somewhat influenced by Heidegger. Tillich certainly is influenced by it. You don't have another one, do you? No, this is it. I'll use the blue then. Yeah, sorry. This was better. Yeah, so Paul Tillich and The Courage to Be being one of his great books and very approachable, right? The Courage to Be. And was at Union Theological Seminary. So this is a kind of right religious, moment of hermeneutics in some way, okay? So, to give you an idea, but again, highly intelligent, certainly not fascist, but, went the way of a kind of religiosity, in terms of the hermeneutical project. Dilthey, on the other hand, is really the modern founder of what's called, say in France, the human sciences, but in the German, the Geisteswissenschaften, right, which is known as the human sciences or the spiritual sciences. And most of you probably know this. In a way, my thinking is vis-a-vis a lot of reading and where we are today is that the Wissenschaften, also prominent during the 19th century, has thoroughly overcome the Geisteswissenschaften. The human sciences have now been overcome by the police sciences. and this is where Foucault comes out of, Deleuze, a society as a control. This has a very long history going back to the 19th century between the conflict between the human sciences, or the spiritual sciences, and that of the police sciences. And the police sciences ruling the day in some ways, led to, in some ways, the Third Reich, in a lot of ways. And this would be another course, of course. But anyway, this is Delphi going back. And Delphi had basically, the multiple levels of experience. And going back to Delphi, we have lived experience, very much like Sartre and the phenomenologists, right, which is the Erleben. Expression. So hermeneutics would begin with one's lived experience coming to an understanding, right? Then the expression of that the expression, and then the understanding. Right? So this is what one would be looking at. The lived experience of the author, the text, or in some ways, the understanding to the human sciences, the expression, and then coming to the understanding. So all forms of spirit would be reduced to an objectivity in history. So hermeneutics, in the Delphian sense, had a claim to objectivity, something we haven't really talked much about, but a claim to objectivity here. But I put it on the table. Yeah. That's the Salvadorian guerrillas calling?
Yeah.
Okay, good, okay. Right. Okay, so this was positioned against Hegel, to put this more in a philosophical history, that Hegel's absolute spirit, the Geist, that came back around in the phenomenology of spirit, which would show its expression in art, religion, and philosophy, was then reduced to objectivity. Okay? This was the new term that was used sort of against Hegel, right? In many ways.
Tillich
The
saw
philosophical absolute. Yeah, what about
Didn't
Tillich? Yeah.
Tillich see the whole world connected by spirit, and he kind of foresaw the internet.
Well, that could be a good possibility, yeah. Remember the word Geist, where these people come out of, is very different from what we use as spirit, or the French use as esprit, right? When we say the spirit of something, we really don't talk about its wit, or its irony and its movement in a certain way. We just kind of talk about an outside, right, in the spirit of something, or someone's spirited, or something like that. Whereas the Geist in German is much more about, as well, community, right? It's something like that. And everybody knows the term zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, right? It's a way of identifying a worldview. A Weltanschauung is defined pretty much by a zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the times, which is actually Thomas Carlyle, the historian's, phrase. The English historian used the spirit of the times, and the Germans obviously picked up on this. Yeah. Even though they lost two wars, the Germans were very good at hermeneutical theft, right, of things, right? Anyway, so, including English Romanticism, they were very, very good at taking those, becoming the modern Greeks themselves. Without Germany, you don't really have a modern Greece in the world. It's interesting, right? Very interesting. So, all right. So to go back, I'm doing this for a reason. I hope. That the traditional approach, again, to hermeneutics had a kind of attempt towards objectivity. It would be an understanding and objectivity, right? And that this could be used in the human sciences, the social sciences, and of course psychology, which is emerging during this time, right? So what it really wanted to take is the speculative sequence out and make this, quote unquote, a rational objectivity, right? So it's very anti-Hegelian in that sense, very anti-Hegelian, the Delphi. So it's interesting because this is what dominates a lot of the social sciences today. Hegel does not really have that much. If you want to read a very good book on this is Jackie Rose's sister, now deceased, Gillian Rose's Hegel Contra Sociology, English political and social theorist Gillian Rose, and it's called Hegel Contra Sociology, in which she basically talks about how Hegel was against this kind of rational objectivity ultimately, right? It was much more about the speculative dialectic, and the speculative dialectic that expresses itself in three forms: art, religion, and then of course philosophy, which encompasses all three. This kind of unfolding of history, in this dialectical spiral, etc. So you have this opposition that's being created in German, in German philosophy, of which Freud, is obviously still, a part of in the tradition. Yeah, you want to say? Yeah.
Would Adorno be against this?
Well, Adorno studied Dilthey. He would be. Adorno is much more Hegelian than Diltheyan. Yeah. No question about it. Yeah. And Adorno and Horkheimer in the Frankfurt School were not hermeneuticians by any means. Right. I mean, the interesting thing to me is about French Freud, right? Is that Lacan was very aware of hermeneutics, right? And knew Heidegger and was very well aware of the transmissions that were going on from being and time forward, and so this was a different kind of level of incorporation. But in the German field, there was very little of this kind of overlap. And in fact, there was very few work on Hegel and Freud, or Hegel and that ultimately became in some ways Lacan's both master and antithesis in some ways. There was a tremendous anathema to Hegel at certain points by Lacan. So, I mean, this is the very, look, I don't like to use this word, but it is complicated, right? And there's a lot of overlap here. But again, to try to situate this hermeneutic. So, anyway, this is what's happening in the dominant German academic model. This is part of what is transferred here to the United States in sociology, a lot of the psychology departments as well. The Wundt also is out of this, Wilhelm Wundt, in terms of descriptive psychology and other things like that. So Dilthey becomes very, very important to a whole spectrum of thinking, right? The whole spectrum. Whereas this becomes very important to a kind of, if lack of a better term, maybe we could call it a kind of religious socialism, if you will, right? Just lack of a better term. I mean, I know that there were many interventions. The social democracy of Tillich was very clear. He was a socialist, right, as well as being a believer, right, and wrote, the Courage to Be as an ontological, encounter, right? One suffered from, I think Tillich in some ways anticipates, along with Sartre, R.D. Laing's work, of the divided self, when ontological security and ontological insecurity are talked about, that people who are not in this moment of really being in the world, and to use a Heideggerian term, in the authentic way, or at least have some kind of authentic encounter with their ontological grounding, in terms of being there, right? Ultimately become very divided and ontologically insecure. And for the existential psychoanalysts, existential phenomenologists, you treat the ontological insecurity. You don't only treat the neurosis or those kind of things. So this is an interesting approach that is being played out mostly, in the literature that I know, and I'm certainly no expert on this, but one book that started a kind of retreat or return, if you will, and retreat meaning a retirement, a kind of redirection and going back to, was the Irving Yalom's book on existential psychotherapy, in which the, quote, Freudian paradigm, although, somewhat accepted, was no longer to be the dominant paradigm in the therapeutic. and that this kind of moment of existential psychotherapy would be a healthy replacement. That's at least the way it was positioned. And what it treats, again, is the ontological insecurity of the being, not so much only the family dynamic, the family complexes, the family romance, right? Or those kind of triangulations are part of it, part of the narrative, but not the ultimate, treatment, right? To have the fulfilled life, et cetera, to take, to maybe rephrase Freud, to take the everyday misery and make it more of a life, transform it into a real project in life, of overcoming and, healthy sublimation. So, anyway, so we have multiple, tendencies going on here, and of course, within this, you can certainly put, Heidegger's aware of Schleiermacher, but he also has the influence, and just to put up another one, is Husserl. And this is, oh, God, yeah, I'll be lost without this. Without this.
I'll go scout.
Yeah. You think next
Go
door?
look for,
Yeah, okay, thanks. So Husserl is the other one in here, even though, the avoidance is trying to get, go against reductionistic psychologism, where everything becomes subjectivized, right? Or leads to a kind of subjectivism. So this is an attempt, too, in the reduction of phenomena, once one suspends all judgment and you begin to try to get back to the thing itself, right? Or the things themselves, right? That you do not get into a position of just psychologism, right? And you want to avoid that so that you'll be able to, look at the phenomena as it really is. It's like Heidegger on freedom. He's very interesting. You don't tell a person what freedom is. You don't use historical values, etc. You basically you try to lead that person to the becoming of freedom, right? Or that essence of freedom. He's really very good on this. I reread Building Dwelling Thinking last week, and there's a very beautiful passage on what freedom is. That as an essence, to let the freedom emerge. You don't tell the person they're slave or free or whatever. You basically are trying to lead to that space that will emerge, etc. So not so far away from coming to terms with one's patterns and certainly one's neurosis and psychoanalysis. But anyway, it's a different approach, and this is coming out of Husserl's phenomenological approach, that you go to the things themselves, which leads to first description, right? And in Heidegger's case and in Dilthey's case, the beginning of a kind of understanding, coming to an understanding. So I'll wait till I get a chalk, because what I want to do is I'll erase this side and Ricoeur, in some ways, since this is an attempt at hermeneutic, is doing something a little different, in his way. And I want to go to the text. I'll ask you one thing that Ricoeur is criticized for. Let me just say this first, is that he doesn't understand Lacan, that language. That the unconscious is structured like a language. I think Ricoeur takes this very much into account. I think that the criticism of Lacan he is offering here is that image is primary for psychoanalysis. So what we were discussing last week, the preconscious region, right, in terms of image formation, on the borderline of the unconscious and the conscious world, right, and the PCS, that image is primary for this, and this is basically an extension, if you will, of the semiotic sphere, right? And there's a muted desire that's going on in image that doesn't especially have, quote unquote, speech or this way. So Ricoeur is looking at image as, as primary here, right? And if you think about Deleuze, for example, in the cinema book, try to make some references here to what was going on in France during this period. The image, is image thought, is part of Deleuze's image movement, is part of his work on cinema. And if you take into account cinema, the silence, right, the silence, etc., maybe in some ways there's something to, really talk about here, because the talkies are not invented until 1928, even though Freud anticipates the talkies by having the analyst sit behind the little home movies that are projected onto the screen, right, where you're not face to face at all. You're facing the screen or the emptiness, right, the empty there in some way. So we'll go back to that. So for Ricoeur, psychoanalysis is not only that the muted desire, if you will, of image, right, is antecedent to language, and that's important to keep in mind in his movement.
One could say
Yeah,
that
please, yeah,
the movies are communal dreaming.
Like Bob Dylan, you can be in my dream if you want to be in mine.
No,
Anyway, I'm just
communal
kidding.
dreaming, we're all sitting in front of the image and all having the same dream
Are we?
simultaneously.
Oh, okay. You mean the movie itself is a dream that we're
Well,
experiencing?
it's a communal dream, yeah.
dream. Yeah, I see. Okay, yeah.
That's why people complain about streaming separately in your living room.
I was criticized heavily for laughing many times at the critique of the bourgeois imperialists in the movie Burn. I was the only one laughing, and people kept saying, "Why are you laughing?" When Jose Dolores would confront the, or when Marlon Brando calls the other imperialist agent a stupid fool and tell him, "You make me sick." And anyway, so I don't know how communal it is.
Well,
I'm just kidding. I see
the point,
it. That's true.
because you disrupted
I
communal
disrupted
dream.
communal dream. Okay, good. I'm glad.
The
I
big
did
laugh
that.
also was when he has the rope when they go to hang, and he says that's how they do it.
Oh yeah, that's funny. After he shows
That one
Marlon Brando shows, this is the movie Burn. Yeah, well, that's how they do it. The Yankee, the civilized people.
Yeah.
They hang. Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. So anyway, okay. Yeah, I hear you. So disrupting the communal. Yeah.
It's different if you're watching.
It's like
in your living
Weekend
room.
when people would believe, "Oh, that's disgusting," and then when they're cooking, the totem and taboo. I don't know if you remember that little section.
When they cook her
Weekend.
husband?
They cook the husband. Yeah.
She
The
likes
chef.
it.
She liked. Well, yeah, of course. Yeah. No, Godard understood that text very well, and many other things. Yeah. The only one left after Agnes Varda has passed away. Nobody of the generation now. Well, it was a great generation. René, Melville, Varda, Truffaut, Chabrol, right? Yeah. Pretty amazing, huh? Yeah. Claire Denis still alive, but she's younger. There's a retrospective of her work at BAM right now.
Yeah,
Very
there's
good.
a great.
Have you seen? Yeah.
No, the great movie that came out a little while ago where Agnes Varda and a young friend go to look for Godard. I don't remember the name of it, but does anyone?
What is it? Agnes Varda and Godard? They did stuff in the U.S. and the Panthers. Yeah.
Right, they were together,
Yeah.
but at the end,
Yeah.
she takes a cross-country journey with this young fellow who's also a photographer, and they go
Right.
across the French countryside photographing
I didn't
people and
think
putting their photos up on
Right.
a big panel.
Right.
And they end up in Godard's house, and he's supposed to be there, but he's not there, and she's knocking on the door, and he never
It's just like him.
never answers.
Right.
So,
Right.
um,
Yeah, if people, I mean, this is, to me, this is very interesting because Godard, when he did his history of cinema, never really did it. I mean, he did a history of sound and he did a history of image, right, in a way. So we have both of these moments going on in Ricoeur, as well. The history of the image was Godard's major thing. This was his Histoire du Cinéma, when he had this exhibition at the Pompidou Center in 2005, which is a 4-volume, it's actually in a 2-volume set in France. And these are the extensions of lectures he gave in Montreal between 79 and 80. of which A True History of Cinema, it's called, which a friend of mine translated, that's available now. Same translator actually retranslated, it's a horrible translation of Bazin's What is Cinema? And he retranslated, but he can't get it in the States, sell it in the States by law, because the University of California, Berkeley, has all the copyright to the original bad translation. So you have to, purchase it through his online site instead of getting it on Amazon, all this. But anyway, okay. So Ricoeur is basically, he's not doing a hermeneutical reformulation of coming to an understanding or the conventions of interpretation or developing a philosophical theory in terms of the Delphian way or what hermeneutics is doing, but nor is he doing the linguistic reformulation, okay, of Lacan. Ricoeur is not really trying to attempt, the structural, sorry about this. It's no good. You can, you know how to spell structural. Structural linguistics, linguistic approach, right? Nor is he doing the hermeneutic reformulation that I was doing here with Delphi, right? So the image becomes crucial. And basically, for Ricoeur, the methodologies of hermeneutics and that of the natural sciences are both insufficient for understanding what psychoanalysis is, right? Because this is a meditation on Freud, but at the same time on psychoanalysis, right? Yeah. Or primarily a meditation on Freud's view of the human subject, right? And then how that becomes translated into what could be considered a science. And is there really an epistemological justification for this?
What we read is just his analysis of hermeneutics. He doesn't get to Freud
right.
yet.
No, not yet. No. But that's why I want to do this. Yeah. So this is Ricoeur later in the book. We seek not merely to describe and classify phenomena, but to understand them as signs. So this is Freud, I'm sorry. Freud and Ricoeur were repeating Freud. Understand them as signs, as an interplay of forces in the mind and not as a manifestation of purposeful intentions working, concurrently or in mutual oppositions. So what Ricoeur will do, he'll take something like this. This is from, I think, Freud's new introductory lectures in psychoanalysis. He's going to take this notion of the interplay of forces in the mind, right? Signs of an interplay of forces in the mind. And then also look at what Husserl's, theory of intentionality is, right? And show that, both are maybe inadequate here, and he will also, move on to his own view of hermeneutics. And so I thought a good starting point, and I thought I could, do this, is by going to basically we'll read it, retrospectively, the hermeneutical conflict. No? Oh my God, oh wow, okay, got a whole pack. You went to buy it, or they had it?
No, they didn't have them downstairs. There's nobody.
Okay, so
nobody
the
there,
radical
so-
imagination owes you, yeah, right.
Yeah, it'll be my,
We reroute
Today's-
here, we reroute.
today's,
The sad part of Stanley's today is we didn't really get to the word radical at all, which was kind of crucial for understanding the left turn, but anyway. Okay, thank you so much, yeah, good,
Yeah, sure.
okay. So we'll just I'll keep these in my bag, yeah, good, thank you, Phil, thank you. Okay, so again, with Ricoeur, let's do this back at the end here. So Ricoeur on page 52, 53, right? Well, he'll end, let's stay at the end. Our perplexity is great, page 56. Let's just read it retrospectively. So he comes up with three categories, right? For hermeneutical, right? Reflection. And of course, this the cogito and the sum, right? The reflection, and he'll go through this. Interpretation. As a restoration of meaning. So you can see already, this is very Heideggerian in so many ways, right? The restoration of meaning. And then finally, interpretation. As a reduction, hi Richard, reduction of illusion. Right? So two forms of interpretation, and Ricoeur is mostly famous for this conflict of interpretation that is always already going on. So let's back up for a second. Let's look at page 53. I'll try to do this through the text back to the board and, and any questions you may have or any understandings. Right, on page 53, the requirement of univocity, the placing of Freud in this section, page 53, presents itself as argument, but reflection does not argue. This first Ricoeur, first principle of the hermeneutic. Reflection does not argue. It draws no conclusion. It neither deduces nor induces. We're talking about hermeneutics, and I'm trying to juxtapose the Dilthian spiritual human sciences and his notion of understanding, as well as the traditional senses of hermeneutics, comparable that to Ricoeur's. And we're doing Ricoeur right now. Yeah. So it neither deduces nor it induces. So it's neither Cartesian nor Baconian in principle, right, in terms of that. It states the conditions of possibility. So for Ricoeur, it's Kantian, the philosophical, whereby empirical consciousness can be equal to thetic consciousness, right? Here, univocal applies to these expressions that ought to be univocal in the course of a single argument, but are not. In the reflexus use of multi-meaning symbols, there is no fallacy of ambiguity. To reflect upon these symbols, to interpret them as one and the same act. So he's looking at this reflective act on the symbol, and if you read this, the symbol becomes very crucial to him. We'll go back to that, but I want to get to the methodological principles. To interpret them as one and the same act. Okay? So number one, the crucial thing here is the first moment of the Ricoeurian project, if you will, in this notion of, the hermeneutical, is that reflection does not argue. It's really about, right, in a way, conditions of possibility when the empirical can be equal to the thetic. Right? And in the multi-meaning symbols, right, there's no fallacy of them being ambiguous. To reflect is on them is one and the same act. And symbol, by the way, comes from the Greek word symbolon, right, which means to come together, by the way. So the symbol is a kind of almost synthetic moment. The thetic before the synthetic is also without that possibility of unity, of apperception. And so he's looking very, very carefully at this moment of the reflection. Now he'll go back and talk about the Cartesian moment, the ego of the ego, if you got to that as well. This is another important part here, and we'll back up there in a second. The second moment, look, the understanding developed by reflection upon symbols, page 53, is not a weak substitute for definition. For reflection is not a type of thing that defines and thinks according to classes. And I think this is great. This paragraph is really, in a way, a very radical approach to investigating phenomena. This brings us back to the Aristotelian problem of the many meanings of being, and that was the problem, remember I mentioned Franz Brentano's lectures on the several senses of the word being that both Husserl and Freud were attending, on the manifold, basically. Today the part, tomorrow the manifold was the battle cry of Brentano consciousness, and also the battle cry of phenomenology, right? Aristotle was the first, translate to leftist politics, you know, today the single issue, tomorrow all the issues unified, you know, in a revolution or something like that. That's a similar kind of ontology of, if you will, of revolution. So Aristotle was the first to see clearly that philosophical discourse is not subject to the logical alternative of univocal equivocal, or univocal equivocal, for being is not a class or a genus, and yet being is said, but it is said in many ways. So for Ricoeur, the saying, going back to both Aristotle, right, through Husserl, right, through his own version of hermeneutics, the speech itself speaks in many ways. Not only speaks only in language, as the house of being, as in Heidegger, or the unconscious is structured like a language. The speech is done gesturally, right? And then, of course, the muted desire of image is a part of the primary. So let us go back to the first alternative. Consider a statement that does not give factual information, we said, expresses only the emotions or the attitudes of a subject. Reflection, however, falls outside this alternative, that which makes possible. The appropriation of I think I am is neither the empirical statement nor the emotive statement, but something other than either of these. So going back to the cogito, right, is going to come down here, right, in terms of the reduction of the illusion that we're actually just thinking selves, right? He's going to try to take this apart, right, to this egological realm, right? And so in a way, he's very much close to Lacan in the sense, made in USA ego psychology is very false, right, in many ways. He's very well aware of this. You know, this is a very smart Catholic. I mean, I have to throw that in there, but anyway, he's you know, he's really extremely well grown. Okay, so this case for interpretation, and these are cases for interpretation. I mean, you know, look, hermeneutics has always been translated as interpretation, but you know, we want to also interpret it etymologically back to its godhead, Hermes. It's the thief. It's the theft of interpretation that's working here. For Ricoeur, it has basically these three heads, right? And hermeneutics does translate as a conflict of interpretations, right? It's this hermeneutics that he's going to do. So it rests entirely on the reflective of interpretive thought. If the double movement of symbols towards reflection and of reflection towards symbols is valid, interpretive thought is well grounded. So all of this is going to be grounded not in the symbolic order in Lacan or the three orders, etc., but for Ricoeur, in terms of the placing of Freud, is around the notion of the symbol, right? Okay, this coming together, and we'll go back to that.
Well, he's playing on, I mean,
he's
Freud
playing.
uses the word symbol,
Right.
but when Ricoeur talks about symbolic
Yes.
logic, it's totally different
Yes,
from Freudian
that's correct.
symbolic. Symbolic logic does not state existence.
But he's not using symbolic logic here.
Ricoeur?
No, he may have mentioned it, but he's not
But
using
he's
it in
using-
terms of his use of symbols.
He's comparing
No.
it to language where you have an or, you either or, and the
Right.
the of the vel symbol, which is must be one thing and not the other. It's it's much more precise than regular language that allows the
Right,
use
that's
of the
true.
word or.
That's true. That's true.
Or
And
implication.
symbolic logic gives you this, but he's not doing symbolic, he's not replacing the notion of the symbol, right, the way he's doing it, with that of symbolic logic.
He's
not
saying
doing
it's not
Frege-
available.
Right, exactly. That's right. That's right. You know,
It's
the
not
father, modern father of symbolic logic is Gottfried Frege, who's not read at all, you know, and there's this big, you know, I mean, this is his name, Gottlieb Frege, who was basically was the teacher of Husserl. Husserl presented his book, The Origin of Arithmetic, to Frege. And Frege says this smacks of psychologism, right, in a way. And so he had to go back and revise it completely, gave it up, and then he wrote The Origin of Geometry, which was the Derridian starting point for, you know, Derrida's career. It was really the philosophical text that Derrida wrote was on Genesis and structure, right? I mean, Genesis and beginning in Husserl's work, as well as the Origin of Geometry, a very long commentary. He translated the Origin of Geometry into French and then wrote a long commentary on it. So these people began with mathematical symbolization, right? And symbolic logic, of which, you know, this is again a very complicated.
Ricoeur is critiquing
yes,
our language,
yes,
natural language, with symbolic logic.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's how he uses it. Symbolic logic is a critique of natural language.
Our language is imprecise.
Yes, always.
Compared to symbolic logic.
Yes, exactly. This leads into another discussion on artificial intelligence and, you know, consciousness and all of this. I mean, this is a very sophisticated level here of which, you know, I mean, I don't know if we really have, you know, maybe we'll do another course when we do a course on symbolic logic in the future. I'll bring in someone who's really good on that.
1 or 2 days. It's
Yeah, 1 or 2 days we need, yeah. We need every day of the week for this in many ways. But look, again, what I want you to see here is that he's doing something different than just coming to an understanding through the arbitrary, right? He's also doing something else than just, you know, the canon he's disrupting. You know, I'm trying to juxtapose, if you will, Ricoeur's notion of hermeneutics versus that of the traditional usage, right? The senses that we have of that. But he fits more into this, right? Into as a philosophical theory that becomes critical and tries to show conflicts of interpretation, right? Whereas this became a strict methodology in Delphi and a strict methodology in some of the, you know, more biblical exegesis. Right?
I think Ricoeur is not being that judgmental. He's just looking at various forms of hermeneutics before he jumps into Freud. And I haven't read that far, so I don't know.
Well, he's placing Freud. He's placing Freud within you know, a kind of tradition. I mean, maybe we can go back, but everybody kind of, I mean, you know, I want to try to be as clear as possible right here. This is really more about interpretation, right? This is more about understanding, right, in a sense, and you know, and the Delphian stuff that I had up there on, you know, expression and meaning, right, etc. Remember, I mean, you're a Derridian to a degree, right?
Yeah, proud of it.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, think about this. When he writes Voice and Phenomena, or translated to Speech and Phenomena, what he's really engaging here is a theory of semiotics that comes out of the difference between expressive and indicative meaning. These are the signs that are at stake. And this is a long meditation on Book 6 of Logical Investigations. This is the starting point for him. Yeah. No,
If you say so.
No,
okay.
no, but I mean,
I have to go back to book 6.
Okay, no, but that's in Husserl. He's reading. I mean, I'm working with the inner
Book
text
6
here.
of Wittgenstein?
No. Logical Investigations of Husserl.
Oh,
No, he didn't read it. Derrida never
I'm
engaged
thinking
Wittgenstein
philosophical
in terms of writing. Yeah. No. Logical Investigations. 1900 was a watershed year. I think I pointed this out at the beginning. Right, Nietzsche dies. Number one, right? The Interpretation of Dreams is published by Freud, right? Logical Investigations, 2 volumes published by Husserl, and The Theory of Speculation by a man named Louis Bachiller becomes the handbook for Wall Street speculation. All this goes on. The beginning of a new finance capital in a different way, the beginning, new dream interpretation, new ways of looking at language, expression, and meaning, expressive signs versus indicative sciences, and probably the watershed moment in terms of the, you know, what our morality really is made of, you know. And as Freud said about Nietzsche, you know, in his autobiographical study, he symbolized a level that I could never attain to in my youth. And then he claimed he never read him. He was very good at denial, you know, he understood, you know, this too, right? So.
That's where he comes up with denial.
Well, I think he probably said, I heard all of this from Lou Andreas Solomon. He might say something like that. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, the influence of Nietzsche on Freud is amazing. I mean, the level. that's
Even though
really
he never
going on
read
here.
him.
But even though he never read him, yeah. Symbolized a mastery to which I could never attain. Right. So, in many ways. Yeah. But you've read the book, right, David? It's translated by Paul Laurent Assun, Nietzsche and Freud.
Yeah, I can't say I read the whole thing.
Okay, yeah, it's a very good book if you're interested in this relationship to the master morality, slave morality, and how it plays out in Freud. The genealogical method versus that of strict dialectics, right? Yeah. It's a very, very impressive book. Okay, so let's go back. Any other comments, Chris?
No, not
Okay,
yet.
okay, not yet. Okay. I feel like I'm in the age of anxiety, which I am. I call it the age of depression. We're way beyond anxiety. That's right. So anyway, so keep this in mind. And again, what he's really trying to do here is show, and maybe let me find that passage before we go on. Page 43. I try to do some textual work today. Page 43. And again, there's philosophy at work. If you look down the page, and this is the recourse of reflection to symbols, the section, right? If you look down, the second paragraph on page 43 that begins, but this first reference of reflection to the positing of the self as existing and thinking does not sufficiently characterize reflection. In particular, we do not yet understand why reflection requires a work of deciphering, an exegesis, and a science of exegesis or hermeneutics, or still less why this deciphering must be either a psychoanalysis or a phenomenology of the sacred. This point cannot be understood so long as reflection is seen as a return of the so-called evidence of immediate consciousness. We have to introduce a second trait of reflection, which must be stated thus. Reflection is not intuition, or in positive terms, reflection is the effort to recapture the ego of the ego cogito, in the mirror of its objects. And we'll go back to this when we do mirror stage, Henri Vallon and Lacan. Its works and its acts. But why must the positing of the ego be recaptured through its acts? Precisely because it is given neither in a psychological evidence, nor in an intellectual intuition, nor in a mystical vision. A reflective philosophy is the contrary of the philosophy of the immediate. The first truth, I am, I think, remains as abstract and empty as it is invincible. It has to be mediated by the ideas, the actions, the institutions, and monuments that objectify it. This is good, right? It is in these objects, in the widest sense of the word, that the ego must lose and find itself. We can say, in somewhat paradoxical sense, that a philosophy of reflection is not a philosophy of consciousness, right? If by consciousness we mean immediate self-consciousness. Consciousness, as we shall say later, is a task. And that's interesting, it's a task. Right? But it's a task because it is not a given. No doubt I have an apperception of myself and my acts, and this apperception is a type of evidence. Descartes cannot be dislodged from this incontestable proposition. I cannot doubt myself without perceiving that I doubt. But what does this apperception signify? A certitude, certainly, but a certitude devoid of truth. As Malebranche well understood in opposition to Descartes, this immediate grasp is only a feeling and not an idea. Interesting, right? If ideas are light and vision, there's no vision of the ego nor light in apperception. I only sense that I exist and that I think. I sense that I am awake, such is apperception. In the Kantian language, an apperception of the ego may accompany, I think, therefore, I accompany all my representation as the classical, Kantian definition of the thinking thing. But this apperception is not knowledge of oneself. It cannot be transformed into an intuition of a substantial soul. The decisive critique Kant directs against any rational psychology has definitively dissociated reflection for any so-called knowledge of self. The second thesis, that reflection is not intuition, enables us to glimpse the place that interpretation has in the knowledge of oneself. That place is indirectly indicated by the difference between reflection and intuition. And a new step will bring us closer to the goal. Having opposed reflection and intuition to one another with Kant and in opposition to Descartes, I would like to distinguish the task of reflection from mere critique of knowledge. This new step leads us away from Kant in the direction of Fichte and Nebert. The basic limitation of a critical philosophy, and critical philosophy, by the way, when a philosopher uses this, always refers to Kant. Yeah. Kant's critical philosophy, a very good little précis, by the way, by Deleuze, worth reading. Reflection is reduced to a single dimension. The only canonical operations of thought are those which ground the objectivity, quote unquote, of our representations. This priority given to epistemology explains why in Kant, in spite of appearances, the practical philosophy, that is the second critique, that a practical reason in fact borrows all its structures from the first, that a pure reason. A single question rules the critical philosophy. What is a priori, and we went through this a little bit when we did Heidegger and some of the other, stuff in philosophy, and what is merely empirical in knowledge. The distinction is the key to the theory of objectivity. It is purely and simply transposed into the second critique. The objectivity of the maxims of the will rests on the distinction between the validity of duty, which is a priori, and the content of empirical desires. So, the duty in Kant, responsibility, obligation, is always crucial in the practical sense, right? And the will is always that a priori, the will to be obligated or the will to duty, right? In some ways. For those of you who like literature, if you read The Fall by Camus, which is really a study of Sartre, Jean-Baptiste Clémence he is really a character here who is motivated, if you will, by the validity of duty, and then ultimately stays with his own freedom, right? In many ways, right? You can also see this at work in Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity, in terms of the existentialist view of duty and obligation. I act as if I'm acting universally, right? I act, which has always been a revolutionary maxim. I act on behalf of the universal, right? Yeah, right? Mr. Trump does not act on the validity of the universal, et cetera. Okay? So this is a very interesting moment, the second critique of Kant, the practical reason, reading pure reason, and the notion of the thinking self as accompanying all its representations. And remember, the crucial term here is representation, right? Outside of that of just pure presentation. Also, the difference between immediate consciousness, the datum of immediate consciousness, versus that of the intuition, right? In a way. Okay, so this is a very interesting moment here. Again, this goes back to the German, and I know some people here, the Wesen Schauen, right? The intuition of the grasping of the becoming, the grasping of the essences themselves, right? This Wesen Schauen that we grasp and take the phenomena itself. Okay, so what he's doing here is, how do we basically say we're going to appropriate or reappropriate something? Again, this goes back to this notion of the interpretation of the restoration of meaning, right? And in another way, how do we come to understanding, together, right, in many ways, okay? So this is important. So it's not so much, duty of reappropriate existence. Epistemology is only part of a broader task. We have to recover, and this is very important, the act of existing, the positing of the self, the self as a posit, right? Not as a given, right? As a posit, in all the density of its works. Why must this recovery be characterized as appropriation or even as reappropriation? I must recover at something which has first been lost. I make proper to me, appropriate, I take back, in a way. This is, the Heideggerian, the Eigenmitglied, the taking of the authentic, right, in a sense, making it my own, proper to me, which has ceased being mine. I make mine what I am separated from by space or time, by distraction or diversion, or because of some culpable forgetfulness. Appropriation signifies that the initial situation from which reflection proceeds is forgetfulness. I am lost, led astray among many objects and separated from the center of my existence, just as I am separated from others and as an enemy is separated from all men. Whatever the secret of this diaspora, of this separation, it signifies I do not at all first possess what I am, right? Again, going back to a critique of the Cartesian. The truth that Fichte called pathetic judgment posits itself in a desert where I am absent to myself. This is why reflection is a task, an Aufgabe. The task of making my concrete experience equal to the positing of I am, such as the ultimate elaboration of our initial proposition that reflection, again, is not intuition. We now say, and this is important, the positing of self is not given, it is a task. It is not gegeben, but aufgegeben. It's a task. Yeah, okay, so I want to point this out too, in many ways, this whole notion of the immediate consciousness, how he gets over that, and how task then becomes oriented here. So let me go back here again. Any questions or thoughts about this so far?
It reminds me.
Yeah, please.
The way
Yeah.
Lacan will talk about the ego versus the subject, the ego
Mhm.
being an imaginary construction.
Right.
He says, cogito ergo sum, the first thing it doesn't acknowledge is speech, language.
Right,
That is, so this idea of an immediate kind of ego that's present to itself, or consciousness
Right.
that is present to itself, would be versus the subject, which is literally subjected to language. It's
Right.
really,
Right.
that you're fallen, and it's a task to
Right.
become,
Right.
to speak as a subject
Right.
is something you have to,
Yeah.
you gotta make an effort.
For I think the difference for Lacan, we fall into language.
Mhm.
I think you're making a good point there. There's a kind of falling into language. But for Ricoeur, the falling is more than just the language itself. It's also this preconscious region of the image that's more primary
Yeah,
in some
right,
ways.
right.
For Ricoeur,
Yeah,
for Ricoeur.
yeah.
And this is where I think his notion of symbol is playing with image together, right? And he's not really interested in the structural, again, this is a kind of difference that's going on between a structural, approach, right, if you will, or Lacanian structural approach, which is, to my mind, the highest level of any, attempt in rereading Freud and making Freud as radical as he was for contemporary times, versus that of maybe an interpretive approach, which has some of its basis in the hermeneutical, moment, but this becomes more of a, if you will, psychoanalysis as symbolic tasks, right? Right? Instead of psychoanalysis only ultimately as talking cure or something like that. So this to me seems to be some of the difference here. Yeah, and we'll see where some of this positing of the self may lead to a debate between some of the U.S. Psychoanalytic community and French Freud, if you will, around self. Psychoanalysis, particularly Kohut, during this time. Yeah. And also then, of course, how does one engage the borderline, since this seems to be, one of the clinical, dilemmas of our time, the narcissistic personality or the borderline personality and the borderline situation. How does one, overcome that aparia, and, is the self itself the aparia that we have to overcome? So that's, I think, part of the tasks here in terms of a melding, if you will, and also a kind of, separation of the hermeneutic from the structural linguistics and what's going on. I don't think Ricoeur denies either, and I don't think Lacan denies either. I think they end up, not similar, but working to certain ends that are can be somewhat synthesized, or at least problematized in a healthy, creative way. That's at least my take. But I like that. One, we fall into language, right? This is also Benjamin, that fallen into language, the Tower of Babel, etc. If you've read Benjamin on violence, on the and also in Ricoeur, falling into the image, right? And outside of that, the immediate consciousness. So, yeah, good. Anybody else? Because I wanted to go just where he's getting the symbol from, just to situate this more philosophically. He talks about the notion of text, but let's start with the symbol in the early part of this. He mentions Ernst Cassirer, page 10, The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, and again, I know there's only so much time in the day, but certainly a study worth reading. It's 4 volumes, but I haven't read all 4 volumes. I read some of them, but anyway, a very, very interesting text. But let's take a look at that. We do not forget that the explicit aim of Cassirer, inspired by Kant's philosophy, was to break the too narrow framework of the transcendental method confined within the critique of the principles of Newtonian philosophy, and to explore all activities of synthesis. Page 10, first paragraph, and their corresponding realms of objectification. So again, Ricoeur ultimately will try to look in this book, I think, and later in his long, conversation, if you will, with psychoanalysis, is going to try to look at if psychoanalysis has an epistemological ground, and outside that way of traditional ways of looking at that. We talked last week about the science of the unconscious, that Lacan says, that's a working definition of psychoanalysis, as it is a science of the unconscious. Ricoeur is going to try to do this, right, to make a case for the science, but in a different way. Yeah, in a very different way. So anyway, but is it legitimate to use the term symbolic for those very forms of synthesis, and again, the coming together, of the Greek word for symbol, in which objects are ruled by functions for those forces, each of which produces and posits a world? Okay, let's do justice to Cassirer. He was the first to oppose the problem of the reconstruction of language. The notion of symbolic form, prior to constituting an answer, delimits a question, namely the question of the composition of the mediating functions within a single function, which he calls the symbolic, which designates the common denominator of all ways of objectivizing, of giving meaning to reality. I don't know if some of you know, again, the American field came up in Stanley's class today. Suzanne Langer, do you know her?
Yes.
Philosophy in the
New
Key is a kind of an attempt to look at symbolic forms, in this way. She's very Casserian. This was a very popular work during the 50s and 60s.
It's applied to art a lot.
Applied a lot to the artwork, yes, exactly, yeah. Suzanne Langer, Langer, yeah. So anyway, but why call this function symbolic? Cassirer chose the term, first of all, to express the universality of the Copernican revolution, which substituted the question of objectivization by the mind's synthetic function for the question of reality as it is in itself. The symbolic is the universal mediation of the mind between ourselves and the real. So the symbolic has a mediating function, indicates the non-immediacy of our apprehension of reality. The use of the term in mathematics, linguistics, and the history of religion seems to confirm that symbolic has this species of universality. You can comment on this as a mathematician. Yeah? No? No? Yeah? We don't have a priest here, but we have a mathematician. I hope we don't have a priest here. Yeah. Anyway. All right. Okay. So anyway, but what he's really trying to do, is the symbol has a universal, signification here, right? Furthermore, the word fit symbol well suited to designate the cultural instruments of our apprehension of reality: language, religion, art, and science, and as Chris pointed out, the philosophy of in a new key by Langer. The task of a philosophy of symbolic forms is to arbitrate the claims of absoluteness of each of these symbolic functions, and many antinomies of the concept of culture that result from these claims. Finally, the word symbol expresses the mutation undergone by a theory of categories. And this is interesting. Space, time, cause, number, when it escapes the limits of a mere epistemology and moves from a critique of reason to a critique of culture. And this is very important because most of the academic disciplines have no idea of what's at stake here, right, in this movement, right? When you're going from, you use terms such as, give me space, right? Right? I need time, right? What's the cause, right? Et cetera, et cetera, and then of course number, right? So in a way, he's very, very, very smart here, looking at this in terms of the Kantian background. And I'm not a Kantian, please, but it's worth reading and very, very important for everything that we do today still. We still live, and most people live in the feudal society. They're still living within, the Aquanian systems. And very few people taking the Copernican turn, much less, the Kantian Copernican revolution in thinking. And Lacan, to go back to Lacan, writes a very seminal essay. Have you read this, Richard, Kant of Exod?
Yeah, oh yes.
Where the table of perversions is actually anticipated by Kant, already. It goes to show you Lacan's philosophical, genius at work. He really understands this. I mean, as most of the tradition didn't do this. I mean, the interesting thing again about Lacan, Ricoeur is trying to do Freud and philosophy. Lacan is, to put it in another kind of language, Freud, the anti-philosopher. Right? Lacan, the anti-philosopher, right, in some ways. So we'll try to work with those two, the conjunction versus the antithetical, as we go forward. All right. So, the notion, the transcendentalism, which continues to govern the notions of objectification, synthesis, and reality, is prejudicial, in my opinion, to the work and description of the classification of symbolic forms. The unique problem that Cassirer denotes by the term symbolic from the beginning, the problem of the unity of language and the interrelation of its multiple functions within a single empire of discourse. But this problem seems to me better characterized by the notion of sign, notion of sign or signifying function. How man gives meaning by filling a sensory content with meaning. That is the problem that Cassirer deals with. So we're bringing back the sensuous, right? We're not only dealing with reason and the rational, right, in a sense, right? Is this a dispute over words? No. What is at stake is the specificity of the hermeneutical problem, the interpretive problem. By unifying all the functions of mediation under the title of the symbolic, Cassirer makes this concept equally as broad as the concepts of reality and culture. Thus, a fundamental distinction is wiped out, which constitutes, as I see it, a true dividing line: the distinction between univocal and plurivocal expressions. It is this distinction that creates the hermeneutical problem. Moreover, Anglo-Saxon linguistic follows see that we are mindful of this division of the semantic field. If we use the term symbolic for the signifying function in its entirety, we no longer have a word to designate the group of signs whose intentional texture calls for a reading of another meaning in the first literal and immediate meaning. And you can see ultimately it's going to go to text next, from symbol to text if you've read this, right? It's the first literal and immediate meaning. As I see it, the problem of the unity of language cannot validly be posed until a fixed status has been assigned to a group of expressions that share the peculiarity of designating an indirect meaning in and through a direct meaning, and that's called for something like a deciphering, that is, an interpretation in the precise sense of the word. To mean something other than what is said, that is the symbolic function. So you can see where he's going to go with Freud here. You're not really saying that, right? Something else is meant here, right? To mean something other than what is actually said, right? For Ricoeur, this becomes a problem of meaning, right? This is always, For Derrida, there's no such thing as the meaning. There's going to be a sliding signifier. At least for the time being.
The end of time, and then the floating signifier.
Yes, okay.
Finds its
Okay.
signified.
You don't mind it being the resident Derridian in here, right?
Oh, no,
Okay.
no problem.
Okay. Okay, so then he goes through more semantic analysis, but I just want to show, here, this whole notion of symbol, what he's doing. Listen, he goes through evil. His first book is called The Symbolism of Evil. Record just a little bit about a background. My first instructor in phenomenology actually translated that book and knew Ricoeur well. This
I was in
way
a
back
seminar where everybody had to give a report on a book, and somebody did the symbolism of
They
evil.
did, okay. Yeah, how did you find it? Do you remember? Or?
Oh, I don't know whether it was the reporter or the book, but it left me kind of cold.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Anyway, well, he'll go into this in terms of, he sets up the experience of the sacred. This is him. And, for those of you that know Mircea Eliade, the religious philosopher, wrote a book on the sacred and the profane. René Girard, who was actually also in this moment of the Lacanian desired deceit in the novel, is his best, but Violence and the Sacred is another book of his about the origin that someone must be sacrificed, right, in order for there to be meaning, right, the violent act, right? Well, yes, of course, but, Girard, anyway, and he's making a big comeback. I mean, he's all over the press in Le Monde and all on the talk shows now in France. So, anyway, the archaic form of avowal. In some ways, what he's really trying to do here is go back to, the symbolic function of denial, avowal and disavowal. Okay, so this is where he's going, right? And he has Eliade, Maurice Lienhardt, van der Loo, all these people that we, don't read or we've heard of, or we may have read in a different incarnation or whatever. And page 14, of course, Augustine and Luther, and one of my, again, another teacher of mine, thought that Martin Luther was the birth of modern subjectivity, not René Descartes. That it's Luther who is the one who gives birth to modern subjectivity in the Western tradition, and it's not the discovery of the cogito, which Merleau-Ponty, by the way, had a very good, beautiful phrase for the cogito, the institution of the West. The cogito, the I think, is the institution of the West. And of course this was the grounding of the sciences of the Copernican revolution in many ways. So very important here. Okay, so rituals and myths and all this on symbol, which is the first part of this. Then he goes on to text later on. Well, different on page 19 he kind of sums up somewhat. This appeal to an interpretation that proceeds from symbols assures us that a reflection upon symbols falls within a philosophy of language or even within a philosophy of reason when we try to confront the meaning of symbol in hermeneutics with its meaning, and this is where Chris was, in symbolic logic. In hermeneutics, symbols have their own semantics. They stimulate an intellectual activity of deciphering and finding a hidden meaning. Far from falling outside the bounds of language, they raise feeling to meaningful articulation. Thus, avowal has seemed to me a word that tears feeling from its mute opacity. Right? All the stages of feeling can be marked off by semantic stages. Symbols are not a non-language. The split between univocal and plurivocal language extends across the empire of language. That which reveals the richness or overdetermination of meaning, in a Freudian term, right, and demonstrates that symbols belong to integral discourse is the work, perhaps interminable, of interpretation. So it's not analysis, right? And I want to put this up, too, for something to come back to, because I'm not positive of, a complete, discourse on this. But the difference between analysis and, what he's going to basically call, the other side of this, the notion of hermeneutics or interpretation. This distinction that he's going to do. Yeah, here. Right. Analysis versus interpretation, if you will. If analysis takes this into account. Yeah.
Well, when he says the overdetermination of meaning, you're going beyond the Saussurean signified to a symbol, so that it's not just a pipe, it's more than a pipe, it's a symbol of something for the Freudian.
Right. And for Ricoeur, too.
Yes.
It's not that different in that respect.
No,
Right,
this
right.
is the overdetermination of
Right.
meaning.
But again, he's trying to situate this vis-a-vis more of a Kantian epistemology, right? Rather than just, and we'll get to this in the second part, because this is going to come back in terms of the dream work and the dream analysis, right? What is a symbol in a dream, right? What is the dream work about, right, in a way? And also the immediate datum of consciousness, is there really a distinction between latent and manifest, right? and for the hermeneutician in this respect. So we'll go back to that. All right, so anyway, this distinction between the analytical and the hermeneutical, again, as I mentioned too, this goes back, Spinoza set up an analysis against the allegorical back in, the 17th century, which is very interesting. The analytic reading of Scripture versus the allegorical reading of Scripture, which was Maimonides. And of course, this is one reason he's really kicked out of the synagogue, why he's excommunicated. What does this mean? The Jews are not the chosen people, right? In a way, this was rebel. I mean, he had radical friends. There's no question about that. I'm sure that's part of it too. But in another way, this kind of level of interpretation that Spinoza. So anyway, we're going to go through this analysis and then hermeneutic, and of course, when we discuss the problem of transference later, we can talk about this as well. In the transference, what is really occurring, if we know at all, and I think Lacan actually even used the word phenomenology in a text on the transference. He actually used, I think, the term the phenomenology of the transference or something like that. So the interminable instead of analysis, the interminable hermeneutic or the interminable interpretation, right? And of course, Freud uses this word, interpretation, but it's the work of analysis, right? So we're going to try to work with these kind of terms as we go forward. All right, so then the question of text is the conflict of interpretation. He begins on page 20. Again, this is a very carefully articulated work, the concept of interpretation. Start with Aristotle. And as Heidegger once said, if you want to read Nietzsche, read Aristotle for 10 years first. And, He had time in the Black Forest. Right. Yeah, anyway. So start with Aristotle. As well known, this is page 20, the second treatise of the Organon is called Hermeneutics on interpretation. From its stems, I call the overly long concept of interpretation, a concept somewhat reminiscent of symbol in the sense of the symbolic function of caesura and many of the moderns, you know? So Peter Bratsis would like this, being an Aristotelian Marxist. He loves anything that goes back to Aristotle, you know, in a way. And all of interpretation and rhetoric goes back to Aristotle. So, you know, nobody reads this stuff. I mean, these people that teach rhetoric in the schools, and, you know, they never read any Aristotle. It's amazing. At best, maybe a little bit of the Poetics, but so it's legitimate to look for the origin of our own problem in the Aristotelian notion of interpretation, even though the connection with the Aristotelian interpretation seems purely verbal. The word itself figures only in the title. What is more, it designates not a science dealing with signification, but signification itself, that of nouns, verbs, propositions, discourse in general. Interpretation is any voiced sound endowed with significance. Yeah, these people were from another planet. I mean, you know, in the 3rd and 4th century. Yeah. Start thinking about even phone semantica, every vox significat, you know, etc. So we have both the Greek and the Latin here, and in this sense, nouns, verbs also are themselves already interpretations, since in them we utter something. But the simple utterance, or phasis, right, is only a part taken from the tonal meaning of the logos. The complete meaning of hermeneia appears only in the complex enunciation, the sentence, which Aristotle calls logos, and which covers commands, wishes, and questions, as well as declarative discourse, or apophansis. Hermeneia, in the complete sense, is the signification of the sentence. But in the strong sense of the logician, it is the sentence susceptible of truth or falsity, that is, the declarative proposition. Right? Very interesting here. You want, you know, elementary, symbolic logic. Yes,
truth or
indeed.
validity.
Yeah.
I did truth tables.
No,
You did?
So-
I'm thinking about the
Okay.
period.
All right.
Scene in that.
The logician leaves out the other types of discourse to rhetoric and poetics and retains only declarative discourse, the first form of which is the affirmation that says something of something. Let us stop with the definitions, enough already. There's suffice to clarify in which the semantic voice, the signifying word, is interpretation. It is interpretation in the sense that for caesura, the symbol is universal mediation. We say the real by signifying it. In this sense, we interpret it. The break between signification and the thing has already occurred with nouns, and this intervening distance marks the locus of interpretation. Not all discourse is necessarily within the true. It does not adhere to being. In this regard, nouns that designate fictitious things, the goat stag of chapter 1 of the Aristotelian treatise, clearly show that there can be no sophistication without the positing of existence. But we would not have thought of calling nouns interpretation if we did not see their signifying import in the light of that of verbs and that of verbs in the context of discourse, and if, in its turn, the signifying import of discourse were not concentrated in declarative discourse that says something of something. To say something of something is the complete and strongest sense of the word to interpret. Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying, but the way he does it is interesting, you know, lays up to this. So this is the strong sense of the interpret. How does this interpretation, again, and proper to the declarative proposition, orient us towards the modern concept of hermeneutics? The connection is not so immediately evident. The to say something of something interests Aristotle only insofar as the locus of the true and the false. Okay? Hence, the problem of the opposition between affirmation and negation becomes the central theme of the treatise. The semantics of the declarative proposition serves merely as an introduction to the logic of propositions, which is essentially a logic of opposition, and the latter in turn leads to the analytic, that is, to the logic of arguments. This logical aim prevents the development of semantics for its own sake. Furthermore, the way to a hermeneutics of double meaning signification appears blocked from another side. And he'll go through double meaning here too, the double entendre. The notion of signification requires univocity of meaning. The definition of the principle of identity, or in its logical and ontological sense, demands it. Univocity of meaning is ultimately grounded in essence, one and self-identical. The entire refutation of the sophistical arguments is based on this recourse to essence. Not to have one meaning is to have no meaning. So there is, for Aristotle, the one meaning, right? Okay? Yeah?
You think that's true, Michael? or
No,
is
I
that-
didn't say that was true.
Okay,
No,
thank you.
no, but go ahead, what were you gonna say? No, I'm sorry to cut, but go ahead, I'm
No,
listening.
that's all- that was
He's
my
looking,
question.
he's looking here for, with this univocity. Thus, communication between men is possible only if words have a meaning, that is, one meaning.
Well, I mean, was that true of Aristotle? Do you think that's what Aristotle?
Oh, well, of Aristotle, univocity is there, He's playing on a work by a very good French philosopher named Pierre Aubonc, who wrote The Problem of Being, and it's never been translated. But if you're interested in this, I have a very good translated publication on this whole notion of univocity of being as well as meaning by Aubonc. He refers to him in a footnote here as well, on page, 1962, deals, remarks, Aristotle takes the word symbol in the sense of submitted. This is on page 21, the footnote, right? Yeah. The symbol is the intermediary, and this is interesting too, from Aubonc, between, thought and being, right? The intermediary. So the symbol provides the intermediary position between, thought and being. And remember, this whole 19th century is a return to Aristotle in Germany. You're not really getting so much the return to idealism, you're getting this return to Aristotelian, formalization, systematization, rather than the Platonic dialogical form, right? The dialogical returns in Russia, right, in the United States in some ways, but not so much in Germany until later, right? Paul Friedlander and others, and of course, Heidegger has a notion. Look, this becomes very complicated again, because Heidegger will critique the Platonic theory of truth, right? Because he still thinks it's working within the correspondence theory of truth. It's not concealment, unconcealment. It's not correlative truth. It's not based on what Chris was saying. She studied the truth tables, the declarative propositions in which are affirmed or negated, or these kind of moments. So there's
You
a
know
much
what
more
they are.
openness. What's that? Whatever?
He knows what they are.
I know what truth tables are. Yeah, he does know what they are. Yeah.
How crazy they can make you.
They make you crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's bourgeois philosophy at its worst. Yeah.
But looking for the truth in symbols was just always hard for me.
Yeah. Okay. So, but anyway, this is where Ricoeur is trying to think. That's the moment here. Symbol, text, interpretation, meaning, and then going into the three moments of later on reflection and understanding, etc. against the Diltheian moment. So anyway, let's just go on. The real thing is here the blocking of meaning, right, that's happening in this one meaning, right? The reflection, leads us back to the area. If man interprets reality by saying something is something, it is because real meanings are indirect. I attain things only by attributing a meaning to a meaning. Listen, again, this has another kind of history and literary theory. Chris probably knows about this, the meaning of meaning. Ogden and Richards take up a lot of the Kantian problematic. So this is a very long a very long history that's at stake here, that, this conflict of interpretations. Ricoeur wrote on narrative, he wrote on ideology, right? He wrote on the symbol, right? I mean, this is not...
literature departments are rife with hermeneutics. It's
Right,
something
right,
you do.
right,
Right.
exactly. Well, hermeneutics would break up the new criticism in
Yeah.
many ways, which was based on Aristotelian univocity. This is really what was based on it, if that helps clarify a little bit for you. I mean, how this became a pedagogical practice, how this became materially located in many departments. The whole Chicago school of thought, of which some of us in this room were subjected to, tortured by, right, was a product of what he's talking about here. This one meaning, this meaning of meaning.
Or the tension
Right.
in
And
the poem
Right.
of this wordment.
Right, exactly.
I escaped
The new
it.
criticism, practical criticism, for those of you don't know, I.A. Richards and C.K. Ogden. Ogden is also famous for the first translation of the Tractatus of Wittgenstein into English with a commentary, as well as another translation of Hans Weiniger's great book on Kant, The Philosophy of As If.
And you
So
wonder
these
why
were
I'm
not
a
small
Derridian.
people. What?
You wonder why I'm a Derridian.
Yes, well, I see, yeah. Okay. I thought you were a Marxist.
You can be both.
You can, okay, good, good, I'm glad. Spectres of Marx.
Spectres of Marx.
So another ghostly demarcation, okay. All right, good, all right. Not to have one meaning is to have no meaning, okay? So this is a principle, ultimately, right, in formal criticism, which, again, I emphasize, dominated the Chicago school, of which, the Chicago School of Rhetoric, which educated a whole generation of English teachers, literary criticism, et cetera, et cetera.
Philosophers.
Philosophers, of course, yes, yeah, no question about it. Okay, so predication in the logical sense of the word, and this is a crucial term, predication.
What page?
This is on page 23. In the logical, puts into canonical form a relation of signification that forces us to re-examine the theory of univocity. Right? The study of sophistical reasoning poses not one problem, but two. The problem of the univocity of meanings without which dialogue is impossible, and the problem of their communication. To use the expression of Plato's sophists, without which attrition is impossible. Without this counterpart, univocity condemns one to logical atomism, according to which a meaning is simply what it is. You know how people say in the vernacular, it is what it is?
No, I
That's
hate
what they're reduced to, right here.
I hate that.
I hate that too.
good.
It is what it is. I hear this all the time. I hear this from the stupid faculty at LIU. I mean, in some ways, it is what it is, the destruction of the university. Yeah, it is what it is. Can you imagine? This is what we've come to, Yeah.
It's a bit circular.
What's that?
It's a bit circular.
It is circular. It is and it is not. It's not circular, right?
a very
At least you
tight
take
circle.
The Hegelian moment of it is, and it is not, right? That at least sets up a principle of contradiction. Right? All right. So it is not enough to struggle against sophistic equivocity. A second front must be opened against Eleatic univocity. Who is the Eleatic? Do you know who he's referring to here?
The
Anybody?
school.
Well, it's a school, but who is the major Eleatic? Who's from Eliad? Yeah, Parmenides. Yeah, this is Parmenides, the univocity of being. For those of you interested in the principle of logical contradiction, it's Parmenides' treatise that's out there. Yeah. And that's what Heidegger wants to engage in the introduction to metaphysics, is the Parmenidean stable, static being, right? Or the univocity of being versus the Heraclitean flux, right? Change and permanence being a constant theme in
Marx.
philosophy. What? I'm sorry?
It's Marx versus Heidegger's Parmenidean.
Well,
Marx is
Heidegger was not Parmenidean in the
Oh, he wasn't?
No. Now, it didn't end up.
Well, doesn't he say that Parmenides sort of already includes the Heraclitean moment?
Yes, yeah.
Basically?
Yeah. Well, being ultimately is empty.
Right.
Is empty, right? But it is a drive towards univocity. There's no question about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, nor is the second struggle without an echo in the philosophy of Aristotle. Breaks out even at the heart of his metaphysics. The notion of being cannot be univocally defined. Vocally defined. Being is said in several ways. Being means substance, and this is good. Again, his notions of what being means. Substance, right? Ousia, quality, time, and place, and so on. The famous distinction of the many meanings of being is not an anomaly in discourse, an exception in the theory of signification. The many means are the categories or the figures of predication. So he's giving you a good philosophical lesson here about Aristotelian notions of predication. I mean, that's why I think this is very important, right? Hence, this multiplicity cuts across the entirety of discourse. No accident that Marx has at his bed, at his reading table, in his lap when he dies, the prior analytics of Aristotle in ancient Greek when he dies. That's what's found on his yeah. No accident. Studies this logical, this organon, to the letter, right? Nor can it be overcome, although it does not constitute a pure disorder of words, seeing that the different meanings of the word being are all ordered by reference to a first and an original meaning. Still, this unity of reference, pros hen legomenon, do not make one signification. The notion of being, it's been recently said, is but the problematic unity of an irreducible plurality of meanings. And that's Albank work, the person I mentioned, the problem of being in Aristotle. Okay? So I do not say that Aristotle raised the problem of pure vocal meanings in the way we shall elaborate it here. I merely suggest that his definition, and again, we're looking at what is interpretation. What does it mean to interpret? As to say something of something leads to a semantics distinct from logic, and his discussion of the meanings opens a breach in the purely logical and ontological theory of univocity. The task of founding a theory of interpretation conceived in as the understanding of plurivocal meanings has not yet been accomplished. The second tradition will be to bring us back to the skulls. The second tradition comes from, and what I put up here, the Schleiermachian biblical exegesis. Right? Hermeneutics in this sense is the science of the rules of exegesis, the latter being understood as the particular interpretation of a text. There is no question that the problem of hermeneutics, and this is what scholars do with Marx. I don't think this is just reduced to scripture. When people say he meant this in surplus value or he meant that, and then they use the German term to explicate it, they're doing exactly the same thing formally with what's going on here. You have this whole tradition there that's going on in the Marxist tradition. It's the canon that is established, and the exegetical is taken up. Right? Yeah. And Lacan, in his way, the return to Freud, this is what he said, let's look at these, semantic fields as they explode with the use of certain words. And thank you, David, for your very good thing of finding the text from 1891 on aphasia and the introduction from the Indiana University Press. Translated 1951 on the notion of cathexis, right, from last week, and it comes from Besitzung, right, which means to take a position in a certain way. It has to do with position, but it was translated initially as occupation. Very warlike language, by the way. Freud understood this in terms of language too. You're preoccupied means you're not in the war yet. When you get into the occupation and the Besetzung, into the Besitzung, you become occupied in the moment. The conflict begins to show itself. and then
Yeah.
the cathectic to the object,
Mhm.
the you know what he talked about, taking an occupation, occupying the object.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Cathexis and occupation
Yeah.
seem to have been used
Yes,
synonymously
yes, right.
in the early days.
Right, right.
And
Setzung in German is position. Yeah, Besitzung is like a strong position, or a strong, like a military position. What is the position of the army? What is the position of the artillery? Artillery, yeah. in a sense.
Freud used other military terms too.
Yes.
With fixation.
Yes.
He said, it's like an army that's taken up a position
That's
and
right.
retreats, but leaves some of its force back,
Right.
which represents the fixation, the
Right.
energetic
Yes.
force.
Right, right. Yeah.
Wait, did you find that you found that text in
I-
He
Synthesizing?
found it in a nice little, what was it? It was this a book you had it at home or something, a monograph.
I'm looking
It's
for
from
my old
it's
Freud
it's
books.
just a translation of
Yeah.
it's a translation of the term that was taken up. Freud wrote a very interesting piece,
Really, yeah.
and I think the interesting thing about this piece, for those of you interested in language, which I think we all are, is in 1891 he offers some rudimentary, moments on this thing on aphasia. It's a meditation on on aphasia.
Yeah, and he really,
yeah.
in a certain sense, it wasn't recognized, but he, in effect, revolutionized the study of aphasia.
Yes.
And it was because he didn't have an academic position or anything.
Right,
no
right.
People, except, I think, well, he was very much in praise of this neurologist, Ewings Jackson,
Yeah.
who was famous at the time.
Right.
And the others he didn't really, have much truck with. But it has all of his, a lot of his trademark ideas of dynamism and against localization of function, especially
Right.
as they were enumerated in neurological studies of injury and localized injury, and how they, you couldn't just attribute something to a localized place or to association neurons, but everything was sort of interplay back and forth between different levels. Very dynamic
Mhm.
formulation. Very
Yeah,
interesting.
I would say that, and also the a little text called on the primal use of antithetical terms, or rudimentary elements for a theory of language that Freud had. The aphasia piece, as well as on the use of primal, primal use of words in the antithetical sense. It's a very early piece too, in the 1890s. Yeah. I'll get the exact reference, but I know the piece. It's very interesting the way he looks at that too. And you can see that he read Aristotle too. I mean, I don't think it's a mistake here of Ricoeur to begin with Aristotle by any means, in terms of his philosophical inquiry, And Kant, of course, was the rule, in the German academia, world at the time. So you can't just deny Kant, we have, another important moment here. Okay, so the balance of early scripture, the biblical, the core of this hermeneutic lies in what traditionally has been called the four senses of scripture. Northrop Frye.
Yeah,
See
I know
where
what
Frye
they are.
gets this
Do you
now.
know what they are?
No, you tell me.
Literal,
Yes, right.
The
The
allegorical.
figurative, right.
the
allegory,
moral,
the moral, right.
and the anagogical,
Logical, right.
which no one knows.
And this is what Northrop Frye takes up,
Yes, because
Yes.
he
the anatomy of
grew
criticism.
up in religion.
Yes, was a priest.
His-
you know that? He's
his
a
father-
deacon in
His
the-
father was a Anglican minister.
Yes, right. But he was a deacon, I think, in the Episcopal Church in Canada. Yeah. Northrop Frye, for those of you who don't know, was a major literary critic. The secular scripture, of which these four senses of scripture were taken up. A book called The Anatomy of Criticism, which I think is Fred Jameson. That's the armature, that's the skeleton right there of Jameson's literary theories and posturing. Very, very important Frye. Yeah. Did works on archetypes as well. Yeah. So, certainly.
On Blake.
And William Blake, of course, that was one of his special areas, right? Yeah. So, Yeah, so anyway, okay, too strong is philosophy more attentive to those exegetical discussions in which a general theory of interpretation was operative. There in particular the notions of, and right here, analogy, allegory, and symbolic meaning were elaborated, notions we will frequently have to return to. The second tradition then relates hermeneutics to the definition of symbol by analogy, although it does not reduce hermeneutics to this definition. Okay? So we have, the literary. What limits the definition of exegetical hermeneutics? First, its reference to an authority, whether monarchical, collegial, or ecclesiastical, right? The latter being the case of biblical hermeneutics as practiced within the Christian communities. And we see this, by the way, in, I don't know if you know Josiah Royce, but there was a kind of communal attempt, the community of interpreters, right? Here in the States, right? Or a community of interpreters. Josiah Royce here, Christian group. Most of all, however, is limited by being applied to a literary text. Exegesis is a science of writings, right? It's a science of writings. Still, the exegetical tradition affords a good starting point for our interpretation for the notion of, and here he goes, with text, right? Can be taken in an analogous sense. Thanks to the metaphor of the book of nature, the Middle Ages was able to speak of an interpretatio naturae. This metaphor brings to light a possible extension of the notion of exegesis inasmuch as the notion of text is wider than that of Scripture. Here's your Derrida, the text, right? With the Renaissance, the interpreted nature, right, was completely freed from its properly scriptural references, with the result that Spinoza that could use it to inaugurate a new conception of biblical exegesis. Yeah, this is in the Political Treatise. The interpretation of nature, he says in the Theological Political Treatise, is to inspire new hermeneutics ruled by the principle of interpretation of Scripture by itself, the formalization of the formalization. Right? This step of Spinoza, which does not interest us here from the strictly biblical point of view, marks a curious rebound of the interpretatio naturae upon the interpretation of Scripture. The former scriptural model is now called into question, and the new model is henceforth the interpretive naturae. He's taking on, of the four senses of Scripture, right, the allegorical. The notion of allegory is taken on by Spinoza. The interpretation of Scripture by itself, this formal analytical moment, right? Okay? So, we'll go back to this. This notion of text, thus freed, and this is the first time he mentions Freud, thus freed from the notion of Scripture or writing, is of considerable interest. Freud often makes use of it, particularly when he compares the work of analysis by translating from one language to another. The dream account is an unintelligible text for which the analyst substitutes a more intelligible text. To understand is to make this substitution. The title, Traumdeutung, which we have briefly considered, alludes to this analogy between analysis and exegesis. Okay?
Nietzsche comes up.
Yes. At this point, we may draw an initial comparison between Freud. We've got all the characters here. Freud, Nietzsche, they're all here. And Nietzsche. Nietzsche borrowed the concepts of Deutung, right, or Auslegung from the discipline of philology and introduced it into philosophy. It is true that Nietzsche remains a philologist when he interprets Greek tragedy or the pre-Socratics, but with him, the whole of philosophy becomes interpretation. There are no facts. There are only interpretations of the facts. Classic Nietzsche. This is a working proposition. Interpretation of what? We shall answer that question later when we enter into the conflict of interpretation. For the present, this point can be made. The new career opened up for the concept of interpretation is linked to a new problematic, that of representation, the Vorstellung. And Stellung in German, by the way, constellation or cluster, is very important. The Darstellung, Vorstellung, etc., etc. Very, very important. Yep. For the present, this point can be made. The new career opened up is linked to the new problem. It's no longer the Kantian question of how No longer I think, therefore I accompany all my representations. So Kant is being, shoved aside here, cut into, Question of how subjective representation or idea can have objective validity. This question, central to critical philosophy, gives way to a more radical one. Very important here. The problem of objective validity still remained in the orbit of the Platonic philosophy of truth and science, of which error and opinion are the contraries. The problem of interpretation, again crucial here, refers to a new possibility, which is no longer either error in the epistemological sense or lying in the moral sense. And this is Nietzsche, playing on truth and lying in the ultra-moral sense. But illusion, the status of which we shall discuss further on. Let us leave aside for the moment the problem we shall turn to, namely the use of interpretation as a tactic of suspicion and as a battle against masks. Right? Very, very good here. This use calls for a very specific philosophy which subordinates the entire problem of truth and error to the expression of the will to power. Very much Nietzsche, right? The important point here from the standpoint of method is the new extension given to the exegetical concept of interpretation. These Christians are good at taking this Nietzsche and bringing him back into the fold in terms of the exegetical concept of interpretation. This is how they worked all the time. You talk about thievery. Anyway, I think it's locked. Was it locked?
No.
Oh,
Someone just asked
okay.
a question.
Okay. And
What is Vorstellung?
Vorstellung is representation. Before the clock, Darstellung, presentation, right? Marx goes through these terms, by the way, the method of, Okay, no problem, check the
My mom's
website.
90th
Okay.
birthday.
Oh, boy, okay, wow, good for you. You got a long life ahead, good. Marx, in the beginning of my method of presentation is different from my method of research. Right, and the method of presentation is of research is the gathering of the material, right? And then what will be presented is this Darstellung, right? So the Darstellung plays out in Marx in a very good way, right? The dialectics of research versus the dialectic of presentation, right? In many ways, yeah.
Can I go back and just try
sure.
to redefine or
Yeah, sure.
exegetical?
Yeah.
What we mean by that here?
Well, what he means by that, and exegetical usually means how you interpret a text, right? It's the hermeneutical, biblical sense. This is invented by who I had up here earlier, Schleiermacher.
Yeah.
That biblical exegesis was a hermeneutical method, right? And you're basically you're explicating the text, right? From the text inside. Right? You're showing what it means.
Okay, but when you brought up Luther before, I thought it was with Luther that we have the interpretation coming in as compared to the literal understanding.
Well, Luther for some philosophers is the beginning of modern subjectivity, right? The subject first appears with Luther.
Well,
Because you have a
You could
personal
say-
relationship with
Personal
God.
relationship with
The-
God.
the
And it also
difference-
brings the
Yeah.
language back
Right,
into
right.
it.
Yeah, go ahead,
the-
Chris. Yeah,
the
bring
difference
language
is a
back.
scholar applies exegetical interpretation
Right.
to the text. But with Luther said, let any man who reads
Yeah,
the
the plural
Bible
blasphemy,
interpret
yeah.
it on his own. He
Yeah.
doesn't have to agree with the church scholar.
And to historicize this is the German peasant rebellion at work, right? That's the historical moment, right? Not Descartes sitting in a stove-heated room, right?
In the
Yeah.
stove.
Yeah, in the stove, so to speak. That's what Foucault
In his
would say.
bathrobe.
Yeah, in his bathrobe, getting up every day at 12, right? So, and meditating that, it is I who think who does this, right? Yeah. What, David, what were you gonna? Oh, okay. No, but that's good. Yes, the problem then here is always the conflict of the interpretations. And as Chris mentioned last week, you have this in literary studies where Harold Bloom came along and said poetry itself is a conflict, right, between egos in which the Oedipal rivalry is always working, right, in the poets. No, I'm just saying. It's one interpretation, but it's an exegetical interpretation, right? That Lord Byron is, destroying someone before him, right?
Well, that's why he calls it the anxiety of influence.
Right.
Writing is anxiety. If you like, it's a psychological interpretation of text. That's
Right.
one way to look at literature. One way,
Right.
not mine.
Wallace Stevens has to,
Wallace Stevens
has
is,
to destroy Milton.
yes,
or-
right, that's right.
It's so
Right.
present,
Yes.
he has to find a way
Yeah.
of forgetting it so he can.
Yeah, this is a way that poetry moves, right? I mean, in a way, this is how it goes, right? And then the
It's
other bastards
reductive,
like
though.
an E. Well, it could be reductive, yeah. E. Cummings, has to destroy all of that, right? Et cetera. Louis Zukowski's A is another example of this, right? Going on where you have this complete destruction of the formal.
I think that in the whole work of poetic tradition, there are people who refer to older works, and it doesn't have to be conflict or ego or tension or anxiety. That's just one interpretation.
Right, no, I understand. I'm not taking Bloom's position. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that this is one moment of what he was asking the exegetical, that you have this tendency in literary studies that the exegetical itself became, this conflict of interpretations, right?
Right.
This
Well,
is
Eliot writes the talent and the
individual,
tradition and the individual
talent.
talent.
Yeah, right.
And he says a good poet will steal from poets before.
Well, this becomes a problem, and maybe it's getting on time. I mean, I'll point to a couple of things here, but this becomes a problem for the left. What do you do if you don't have a tradition to work with? I mean, if all these people that are going around as democratic socialists, right, et cetera, don't know what the tradition is, right? What model are you really taking forward? I mean, this is another thing. How can you destroy something unless you know the tradition? Right? This is part of Eliot's thing. It's a conservative position, but it's very accurate. Marx would probably say the same thing. I mean, Marx didn't just dream surplus value out of the air, right? He read Ricardo, he read Smith. You read the theories of surplus value, you get your elementary text in economics there. That's economics 101 for Marxists, right there. So how can you do this today when you have people saying we have new people that are, modern monetary, what was the MMF you mentioned today? MMS, right? What are they called?
No, MMA.
MMA, what are they? Modern monetary analysts?
No,
Or
MMT.
Theory.
modern monetary theory. Now, anyway, I doubt any of these people can speak about, Rory knows, see, Rory keeps in touch, yeah.
Polemic against Krugman now.
Yeah.
It's broken out
I
into
see,
times.
okay. I don't read the Times that actively. I mean, I look at it.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Because they're sort of close, but not that close.
Right,
And,
right. Okay, let me just point out a couple of more things, and we'll go back to the second, because he's going to use it constantly, what the exegesis is. Anyway, on page 27, I have neither the intention nor the means to attempt a complete enumeration of hermeneutical styles. The more enlightened course, it seems to me, is to start with a polarized opposition that creates the greatest tension at the outset of our investigation, the greatest anxiety, right? According to one pole, hermeneutics is understood as the manifestation and restoration of a meaning, I had put that up, right? Addressed to me in the manner of a message, a proclamation, or as sometimes says, a kerygma, right? And then according to the other pole, it is understood as demystification, as a reduction of illusion. And this is basically Fred Jameson's use of this in The Political Unconscious, the second meaning here, right? Psychoanalysis, at least on first reading, aligns itself with the second understanding of hermeneutics. So we must consider this double possibility, this tension, this extreme polarity, and the truest expression of our modernity, the situation in which language today finds itself comprises this double possibility, this double solicitation and urgency. On the one hand, purified discourse of his excrescences, liquidate the idols, go from drunkenness to sobriety, realize our state of poverty once and for all. On the other hand, use the most nihilistic, destructive, iconoclastic movement so as to let speak what once, what each time was said, when meaning appeared anew, when meaning was at its fullest. Hermeneutics seems to me to be animated by this double motivation. Willingness to suspect, willingness to listen. Vow of rigor, vow of obedience. In our time, we have not finished doing away with idols, and we have barely begun to listen to symbols, right? It must be that this situation in its apparent distress is instructive. It may be that the extreme iconoclasm belongs to the restoration of meaning. So I'll leave it there. Then the restoration of culture, he goes on. What I would like to do, I mean, I know that next week we're at the Historical Materialism Conference, but again, I'll send out an email if you want to meet during the week, in this class. I'm open, Thursday or Friday in the evenings. If we can't do it, we'll just pick up, the following weekend. But I would like you to start reading, the second part of this. We'll go over this more. I thought today we did a lot of good, at least theoretical work. Yeah.
For those who aren't here, could you say where, tell us about the Historical Materialism Conference?
Yeah, I don't know exactly where it's on 18th Street.
Is it
Yeah,
the
it's
same as
First
last
Avenue
year
and-
or different?
No, it's on the west side this time, yeah. I'll send out a message. I mean, I don't know. Peter knows all this time. He
I
follows
thought it
this.
was at a high school.
Yeah, it's in a high school on the west side. Yeah, 18th
James
Street.
Baldwin.
Is it James Baldwin or Rustin? It's Baldwin
Baldwin.
now? Okay, it's at
Wait, so
James
what are we
Baldwin High School, and Peter, myself, and Arto are doing a little, chat on prosperity Marxism, and then the other, speaking of interpretations, and then Chris is going to moderate a panel. What was it, in transindividuality?
Accursed austerity.
Accursed austerity. Okay, good. Well, we're going to both are interconnected. So that's 1 and 3 next week. Yeah. So I'll send an email to the group about that. But anyway, please start to read. I know it's a long section. You could reread this. Why don't we read How to Read Freud, the introduction, right? Up to page 159, right? And we'll look at the piece on narcissism that was, we were going to do today, and we'll certainly go back to the unconscious as well. But yeah, today was good. Listen, today, 1891, the piece on aphasia, very important for a kind of Freudian theory of language. The way he frames, I think, hermeneutics a little bit differently than the tradition does, right? And, of course, the problem of translating German, both into English and into French, what's going on here, because Freud speaks a pretty plain, German, from my understanding, and the use of military metaphors. People forget that this war is always going on, right? I mean, they understood this, in terms of reality in Sartrean sense is conflict.
Well,
Right.
certainly,
Yeah.
in 1915, when the unconscious is written.
Yeah, the outbreak of the Great World War,
The war
right,
was going
right,
on.
the big one. Yep. Yeah, the man from Sarajevo.
Yeah, and narcissism in 1913, you have,
Right.
he's breaking with Jung.
Yes, he is. He's breaking with Jung on the narcissism
World
tournament.
War I is breaking out.
Right,
There's,
yeah.
I-
Otto Gross is going crazy with every,
and he's
yeah.
quoting, and he's so quoting Schrader, so there's all
Yeah.
this kind of.
And as you
conflict
pointed out, well, the
appears.
wartime neurosis that
Yeah.
followed all of this, where he was going, later on. Yeah. on the notion of phobia. So good. Okay. So the thing about Ricoeur is I think he's very lucid, and he's very, very systematic in his attempts here. This is really first-rate phenomenology.
So we want this read for 2 weeks?
Yeah, from 2 weeks, or I'll send an email if you guys are open. I'm fine with doing a session during the week, but I think people have conflicts. But
Yeah.
I'll put that out. Yeah. If not 2 weeks, yes.
Where's the official